Well, there is a lot to talk about, um, with regard to the Middle East, both modern and historical. Um, we were earlier talking about, right, the idea that the Middle East is not this monolithic place where the borders we have necessarily make any sense. In some cases, they might. In others, they don't. Um, where does the modern Middle East take its borders from? I mean, where and how does that impact things like national identity when you've got all these different groups of people sort of lodged in these artificial boundaries?
Yeah, initially it has it has no foundation. It's just imperial interests of the British and the French trying to figure out where oil pipelines can go and the most feasible route for things like the um, like Israel, for example, its most northern border was decided by a British oil company, uh, instead of some kind of biblical way of figuring out where the country should be and the northern border of it. The same is true, like for figuring out why the random separation of Syria and Jordan exactly at the point that they're separated at. The people on, especially that border spot, um, it's if you cross, they are not. When I say the same people, I mean like the same food, the same accent, the same dress, the same clans, everything. The Iraqi Syrian one is usually the example I like to use because it's the most it's like a twist. Like what's that director's name? M. Night Shyamalan or something.
Yeah.
It's like one it's like one of those situations where uh the so England had promised the Hashemites a kingdom after they helped them defeat the Turks in World War One. So this kingdom, they give them they promise them certain borders, and within these borders is Mesopotamia and the Levant, at least inland Levant, and then um, so they have Faisal, who was one of the Hashemite princes, arrives in Damascus, and he's coronated as the king of Syria. And the idea was to give his older brother Abdullah, who eventually becomes the king of Jordan, to give him Baghdad, and he would be the king of Iraq. Iraq being Mesopotamia, not in today's borders, not in today's Iraqi borders, but actually the real Mesopotamia, like the whole Euphrates. So, but Iraq, it took a while for the British to give that up. They wanted to kind of stay there a little bit. So the people that live in the western part of the Euphrates are making a lot of problems for the British. They're doing like I don't know, like little skirmishes with British outposts and things like that. So the British said, let's go ahead and give this little piece to Faisal from now. And then when his brother comes, the rest of the country will unite anyway, because they're two brothers. They're just going to unite it. And that's what the people were like, yeah, let's do that. Let's just go join Syria for now. And then after that happens, the French come into Syria and kick Faisal out. So then the British feel bad and they give Faisal Baghdad instead. And Abdullah gets Jordan, which is just this vacuum of nothing that nobody had or wanted. So Faisal, though, in Baghdad now doesn't have that western portion of what he would have had, not because it's attached to Syria now, which is today Deir ez-Zor and Hasaka and all of these areas that are Mesopotamian. It's really funny because actually the opposite happened of what they were kind of going for. Iraq becomes independent, and Syria stays a French mandate.
You mentioned Jordan, and whenever I look at the Jordanian border, I think, what the heck is that?
It looks like a gun.
I was gonna say, well, looks like an air horn, right?
Yeah.
Or some kind of tabanja, some kind of pistol. Um, and you may have said it. It's the place no one wanted, but why that shape? Is there any logic to the shape of Jordan?
Yeah, so they cut it off from the region of the Syrian Jordanian border on the west side of it. It's called Horan. So it's split. Haran is split in half between Syria and Jordan, and they use the Yarmouk River there as a starting point, and then they give like the forgot the English name, but it's like the Thalweg, I think they call it, to Syria, to the French mandate. Syria wanted more, and then the British got mad, and there was a big problem. But they give them that, and then that's where like the border kind of establishes. So that is an arbitrary one. Going down, the one with Saudi Arabia actually, because as you know, the Hashemites are from Hijaz. So they had a kingdom in the capital being in Mecca before the Saud family took Hijaz from them in 1920s. So
You may want to locate Hijaz and Najd and all these places for people who otherwise don't know anything
sure,
about the Middle
yeah,
East.
Hijaz is the west coast of what is today Saudi Arabia. Najd is the central, the middle section of Saudi Arabia. So the Saud family, they took Hijaz from the Hashemites, but before that, the southern part of Jordan, where Petra is, Ma'an, Aqaba, these places, they were attached to the Hijaz kingdom. They weren't Jordan, because that's Arabia, that's
Yeah.
Hijaz, like the people there. So once the Saudis took Hijaz, Abdullah and Amman like quickly went and took those portions and kept them for Jordan so that the Saudis don't take them, because they're very strategic. It gives Jordan a port to the Red Sea, etc. So that's how that one happened. Do you see there's this, like, if you look at the Jordan map, there's this like indentation on the east side of it.
Yeah.
It's known as Churchill's hiccup, that he had a hiccup and his hand just went like this, but that's not literally what happened. It was another thing with the Saudis where there's a valley there called Wadi Sarhan, where there's like a lot of Bedouin grazing rights and things like that for that, because it's an oasis in the middle of the desert. So the Saudis, they had these forces called the Ikhwan. They're not like the Muslim Brotherhood today, but they were more like the Islamic State. That's how they functioned, to the point where eventually even the king of Saudi Arabia went to war with his own army, like against them. But those guys took that valley for the Saudis, and today the tribe for which the valley is named after, Wadi Sarhan, so the Beni Sarhan, they're actually on the Jordanian side of the border, but their own valley is in the Saudi side of the border.
Yeah, it's bizarre how all the shapes do come to fruition, and you get this Jordanian identity that exists as of when, right? Sykes-Picot, I mean, like the 30s, the 20, when does that happen? I mean,
it's so in the diary of the King Abdullah the First, he gets there. He gets to Ma'an first, and then he goes to Amman later. And he at first he's annoyed because he doesn't know what to do. He's thinking, well, Damascus is still the goal here. We got to get these French out. These Syrians, he calls them in Jordan, where he's at, because these Syrians are really annoying. He's not used to the Syrian culture. He's used to the Arabian culture of Hijaz. That's all he knows. He wasn't fully sold on the aspiration of Syria and Iraq. he wanted that for his brothers. He had three other brothers. So they could deal with that. I want to stay here in Hijaz and Yemen, maybe potentially take that over. But I don't want to go up there because they're too modern for me. That's how he was thinking. And then when he gets there, he calls them Syrians in Jordan are bothering him. The Syrians are bothering him. So there is no concept at this time of a separate nation, if you will, of Jordanians. And then you get in before 1948, it's called Transjordan. 1948, he annexes the West Bank after the war with Israel. And because now he's on both sides of the river, so now it's the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, the river. But there was no, even for him, even by the time he died, he still didn't think of it as this is a different people or we're different. Like he was thinking Damascus is still the goal. We have to get there. This is the kingdom of Syria that Faisal lost. Yeah.
And the British and the French are obviously the key players in the formation of what, when we turn and we look at the modern Middle East and we see these names and these borders and, we'll associate different governments and languages and things with these people. It's far more complex. But apart from the French and the British, you've mentioned like tribal, people or people in power at the local level. What about, Turks or Persians? Do they have a part of this conversation in the formation of, the borders of the modern Middle East, especially Turkey, which was the Ottoman Empire, right before this time?
Yeah, it's a great question. So Turkey was cut up into many, many pieces after World War One. Constantinople and Smyrna, and these parts were all going to go away from the Turks, and even Mardin and Urfa and Antioch and these places also were included in the Syrian mandate. They weren't in Turkey. Hakkari was for Iraq. It was going to be West Armenia. West Armenia was for Armenia. It was going to be like the old days. And Mustafa Kemal Ataturk has this nationalist secular revolution where he kind of just, this is like 5 years after the end of the war. And by that time, the Soviet Union is already the Soviet Union. It's no longer the empire of Russia. So these guys now want to kind of stick it to the Allies, and they support this nationalist revolution of the Turks, not because they care about the Turks, but just because they're against the Western powers. And the Turks are able then to go get Constantinople all the way to Adrianople on the Greek side, and then obviously Smyrna. And they took Urfa and Mardin and Midyat and Hakkari and all that, but they didn't.
Those are in the far east of what is today Turkey.
Yes, and they didn't get Antioch though. That stayed under the French mandate, and then in World War II, the French gave it to Turkey as a way to bribe them to stay out of World War II, to not join the Axis.
Interesting. Wasn't that the kingdom of Hatem or something like this?
Yeah, it was a province called Hatay. Yeah, it was included Alexandretta, and in Arabic they call it Liwa al-Iskandaruna. So Syria hasn't forgotten this, and Syrian maps, it's still part of Syria. And if you go to Syria, it's still, they count it as part of Syria. It's just Turkish occupied, like the Golan Heights with Israel. And even the whole northern strip across the Taurus Mountains, that includes Orfa and Ain Tab and all these cities, for Syria, that's still Syria. It's just occupied by Turkey.
Just a trivia note, Ain Tab it's Aramaic for sweet water, or the good water, the Ain Taba, or the spring, the good spring, right?
Yeah.
But the first time I ever heard of that region was in the third Indiana Jones movie. Remember Last Crusade? They head over to this what, it's like, oh, is this just fiction? Because we don't see those maps anymore. We don't see those borders, where they head to Iskandarun, and you've got this little republic carved out that later, now it's going to be Turkey. And then, you mentioned a lot about the East, and I think this is where a lot of us, growing up in the West, once we hit the basic borders, we're not very, there's not a lot of depth in our understanding. And of course, we don't have it's not part of our pedagogy, right? It's not part of the stuff we learn about the Middle East. We're lucky if in, what is it, fourth grade or something, I forget what, maybe it's third grade, where you learn, the basics of civilization. So you hear words like Mesopotamia, you get to learn about Sumerians, Babylonians, and things like this. But when it comes to how that entire region develops, it's sort of like a dark spot in our own learning tradition, right? And it's where, modern Turkey's east is today, that we have such a confluence of different peoples, languages, cultures, religions. And those cross borders with Iran and Iraq and Syria, that part of Syria that jets out, the Jazira, they call it, the island, right? This, little
East Wing.
yeah, the East
Yeah.
Wing in Syria.
Yeah.
That whole region is really interesting because you've got people who speak Aramaic in its different dialects. There's Western dialects, there's Eastern dialects there. And you've got people who speak forms of Kurdish, which is basically, it's somewhat intelligible with Persian. They're very close. And structurally, I mean, it's obvious. But, and those languages are closer to English than, let's say, Aramaic or Arabic, in the local dialects of, people speak Arabic there, Mardin, right? Mardin is Southeast Turkey, and that's Arabic is functional. I mean, I think that's the main language there, right?
Yeah.
And then there are Armenian speakers, what's left of them, Turkish speakers, and I'm not sure if they're, Azeris, cross over into that part of Turkey or not, but that's a different dialect of Turkish. And
I think Turkoman.
Right. And they're even in northern Iraq, right?
Yeah.
So, there's this border, but it wasn't the French or British who made it, right? Like, this is anything that's under the Turkish border is made by the Turks. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it's fair to say. There's, I guess there's like a French or British starting point to where to fight at, but yes, from the inside, I guess, yeah. Regarding Iran, because you asked about Iran too, there's the natural boundaries. It's like that cut out the Fertile Crescent from like Anatolia and Persia are the Zagros and Taurus mountain ranges. So anything that is a border that is not that is it's arbitrary. It's not, there's no natural, really, there's nothing that's dividing it naturally. So
there's a logic to, the west side of Iran and the southern portion of Turkey, right? Mountain ranges are there. But
yeah. So there's this spot on the Gulf called Ahwaz. It's a province of Iran. There was an Arab tribe that was a sheikhdom there up until 1925. I think Beni Ka'ab, we say Beni Cha'ab in the colloquial. So they were mainly based in Kharam Shahar, is the Persian name. We call it Muhammara, and Abadan. So these are the most oil-rich Iranian areas. And they still have Arab majorities there till now. So the Shah is the one who took them from this Sheikh Beni Ka'b. And this area, there's no, like I said earlier, there's no natural border like between this like southern Iraq and these places, to the point where till today the Ahwazis, they sneak over the border to go fishing on the Iraqi side. Saddam tried to get those back in the Iran-Iraq war, but he did. He got them back. He put the Iraqi flag up, and then Iran took them back again. So there's still a point of dispute. Iraqis, like, they claim and if you ask Iraqis, usually they'll tell you, yeah, those belong to us. Ahwazis will say, no, we're our own thing, just like Kuwait says we're our own thing. But if you hear them talk, if that, which I don't know if it's based on that, I guess it shouldn't be based on that, but if it's not, it's like the whole Middle East was just these tribal little pockets and sections of different emirs and sheikhs everywhere. So if you think of it that way, that everybody should have this kind of this little piece of you're an emir in this oasis, in this badia. If that's the case, then there should be 1 million countries in the Middle East. So I don't know.
That's really the question, I think, because you've got, do people groups mean countries? Do languages mean countries? That's been a European problem for a long time, since the Middle Ages. And, what defines a country? Okay, well, is it a part of a larger imperial apparatus? Is it a local kingdom? And are there like 100 of those local kingdoms that you are either bonded together or not bonded together? A place like Italy, you've got all these local dialects and versions of what it means to be Italian, and yet they emerged from their own civil war in the late 19th century as this one Italy. And so just thinking about the Middle East, you've got these tribal structures, you've got clan structures, you've got some kind of idea of what it means to self-rule, and you also have historical peoples. And sometimes those historical peoples, exerted their own self-rule, the Assyrians, let's say, for example, in northern Iraq. And other times, these groups lived under the patronage of some other imperial power. And in particular, since the Persians took over, you had a lot of these other groups within, the structure of what it meant to be Persian. Persian language, for example, before the Arabs rose to prominence, it took Aramaic, on its western frontier, and then in its own development of Middle Persian starts incorporating Aramaisms, even if they're not spoken Aramaisms, but they're written Aramaisms, right? Mm-hmm. Where they'll write words in Aramaic, but speak the Persian word when they, when they read it out loud. And so you have this fusion that starts to happen. And then the question is, okay, well, we have different client kingdoms emerge, over the next 2,000 years, whether it's under, Roman rule, Persian rule, whatever. That's sort of like this sheikhdom, or I don't know what the proper term would be within the Arab world. But it seems like, we could redraw the Middle East, and there could be a different logic to redrawing the Middle East. But to what end? Can you be like Syria, Iraq? Those are classic examples, because in recent, last 20 years, there's been so much conflict there, and people in the West, let's just say North America, for example, don't really have a strong understanding of what a Syrian is. There's Syrians who grow up, speaking Kurdish, and then when they walk outside the home, they speak Arabic, or they speak Aramaic, and they walk outside the home, they speak Arabic. And there's other people who are, their ancestors may have spoken one of those languages, and now they speak Arabic, and now they sort of have a new Arab identity on top of that. And they're different, let's say, than the tribal Arabs. Think of the Homs region of southwestern Syria, where you've got these people who are, they've taken on the Arabic identity. The Arabic culture has become it's become their main culture. They would say that they are Arabs. And then you've got people who, 2 generations ago were living the traditional Bedouin lifestyle, who are becoming more sedentary. And that's we live in the West, especially the New World, places where people came from everywhere. They forged new identity. And so a border meant something less. It means something less out here than it does in a place where there's, people can speak of a homeland, right? Um, and that homeland, okay, does that homeland, historically mean that it justifies having a country today? Or, uh, you know, is a new um, identity, justified, like an Iraqi identity, a Syrian identity? Persia is a great example, I think, just because Persia is not like everyone's Iranian and that's it. Like there's so many different subgroups that go back to the ancient world where, the leaders of Persia and the different imperial powers, the Achaemenids, the Arsacids, the Sasanians, they all ruled different groups of people, and within that context, they had, this Persian imperial thrust to themselves, or some kind of, I don't know how nebulous the identity was, but, is identity the main factor then in nation making?
Yeah, I think Iran and Turkey are somewhat unique in that they are vestiges of their empires. And then they have they're kind of like smaller versions of what they were, and then incorporated into them is still the diversity of what an empire would have at a smaller scale. Whereas in the areas that are within those mountains, so within the Zagros and the Taurus, the Arab states, they are there kind of by accident. That it's not intentional. Whereas Turkey and Iran, you have to pry away their provinces. These guys are the ones you make. So up until 100 years ago, um, it was very clear who was an Arab in the proper sense and who
Hmm.
wasn't. Um, and that all went away with Arab nationalism, kind of like the Great Arab Revolt, all the way through the 50s and 60s and 70s of we're Arabs and we want like Arab unity because we're Arabic speakers. Christians played a huge role in this, in the ideology of Arab nationalism, like Michel Aflaq and George Antonios and these guys. Michel Aflaq made the Ba'ath Party, so and he was the prime minister. He's Syrian, but once the Iraqi-Syrian Ba'ath schism happened, he was on the Iraqi side of it. So Saddam made him the prime minister of Iraq, a Christian guy, which is never heard of, Um, so this now it's kind of been nobody really remembers uh, why they're an Arab today, the people who maybe wouldn't have said they were Arabs 100 years ago. But uh, the view is that Arab nationalism is dead or is dying ever since Saddam, so it's been going away. And if that's the case, and I kind of see it, then yeah, I think it'll go back to people who aren't Arabs knowing that they're not Arabs. And the way we know is because in the late Ottoman days, right before it was speakers in the urban areas or the cities, Muslim or Christian, didn't matter. And they would complain to the Ottoman authorities in their area about the Arabs, because the Arabs would be the ones who are coming in or raiding them or just like getting whatever they want to get and then going back into the desert. Uh, so there was a clear distinction. And a lot of the Bedouin have been settled, but those Bedouin who have been settled still know that there is a distinction between them and the previously settled people. There's a cartoon on Netflix called Masamir. It's a Saudi cartoon for adults. It's really funny. Um, one of the guys, he's probably the hardest to understand. He's a Bedouin in origin whose family had been settled, like his father or his grandfather were settled. So, but you could totally tell, not like in his Arabic or in his the way he behaves in society versus like the people who have been settled for generations. Um, so this, I think it's just like a caricature of, like a symbol of like how in these countries, although the Bedouin have been settled, it's still not an easy fit. There still is a distinction between the urban life and the rural or the nomadic, even if they're settled.
That's an ancient theme. I mean, that goes back to Gilgamesh, and even biblical themes of the pastoral societies versus the farming, societies that were more sedentary and established. And what happens when you take a bunch of pastoralists and you settle them somewhere, and you have the modern, or you have the ancient kingdoms of Israel and Judah, as a result.
Yeah, when Faisal became king of Iraq, and he was worried about Iraqi unity, that was his major concern. It wasn't about Sunnah and Shia. It was about this, what you're saying exactly. This trying to find a way to get people from Baghdad, the people from Basra, from those big cities or Mosul, to feel like they can have the same national identity as the people in, the Ramadi Desert or on the Saudi border and these areas. It's a different, it's the things that those people look for in a government is not the same thing that these other people look for. I guess to a lesser extent, it can be thought of like the Midwest states or the southern states here versus, say, like I think they call them flyover states, or
Right. Yeah.
Versus LA or New York.
Well, how does a Lebanon happen in the midst of
Oh,
all of this?
man,
Because
oh,
to
what a mistake that was.
right.
Yeah.
I mean, they may not think so,
it,
but
it backfired for them big time. So they wanted this. It was intentional. This Christian state. That's what they wanted. Maronite Christian state that the French were supporting, but they wanted greater Lebanon. So it wasn't just Mount Lebanon where the Christians was, and it wasn't just where the Christians were, and it wasn't just Mount Lebanon plus Beirut. It was the southern sections. It was these northern sections like Tripoli.
yeah.
And when they did that, they no longer became the majority. They no longer became the state that they were wanting to become. They wanted the land, but they still wanted to become the majority, and it wasn't possible. And so it's like they missed them, and the French missed everything they can do to make this a good situation, like all the other possibilities. So, okay, if you want to make it big, you should have made it a little bit bigger then. Maybe include Wadi Nasara, which is this exclusively Christian area in Syria that's right on the Lebanese border.
Right.
And the anti-Lebanon mountains where Ma'alula and those villages are. So you could have made it a more Christian state, or you could make it not exist and make it a Syrian province. It would have been better in the long term, in my opinion. And then the Christian voice and percentage and strength in Syria, the French Syria, would have been a stronger one, because after the French mandate, Christians were very influential in Syria. So if you add all the Lebanese Christians to that, imagine Syria's future after this. So it was a lose-lose for everybody involved.
Why hasn't the border changed? Like, I mean, start with Lebanon, just because they've had so much civil war. You've got the only really place I think where borders have visibly changed since World War I is the modern state of Israel, and the Sinai, the Golan Heights, places that
had wars.
Yeah, they had specific wars, and yet we've got the civil war in Lebanon, or we've got whatever's happening in Syria, the different Gulf wars in Iraq I mean, I guess you could say Kuwait became Iraqi for a month,
Yeah.
however long. that border change.
Yeah, yeah. And there were other, like in 58, Iraq and Jordan became one country. It was the one Hashemite kingdom for 6 months. Then the communist revolution happened in Iraq, and that ended. Um, and then, but yeah, with Lebanon, I think that um, it's the borders did change in a way, in that it's no longer one country, it's multiple countries, and it doesn't really have a functional government. um Syria occupied it for a long time. The Hezbollah section of Lebanon and Syria is essentially the same country. Iran rules both of them. um Whereas the Maronite part, there's not really a lot of crossovers. A lot of Lebanese people, they're very proud to be Lebanese, but what really is being Lebanese? Is, if I'm a Maronite, is Lebanon the same thing or that to me as if I'm a Shia? And when I think of Lebanon as a Shia, or if I think of Lebanon as a Maronite, am I thinking of the same country?
Mm.
I don't know if I am. Um, uh, Regarding the borders, just because you were saying they haven't really changed, which is true for the most part, but something interesting happened recently, and I just remembered. The UAE essentially annexed Socotra, the island.
It did.
Yeah, and they stopped letting people with Yemeni citizenship come in. They are doing everything uh that they want to do. They're granting the Soqatri citizenship.
Really, they're like
Yeah,
Emirate citizenship.
yeah, UAE citizenship.
So Socotra is this island that, just as you're coming out of the Red Sea and going into the Indian Ocean, it's south of Yemen and north of Somalia, and it's unique in that, like, it's got this form of Arabic. I mean, is it fair to even call their own language Arabic? Because when you get south, far south in the peninsula between like Yemen and Oman, and then this island, Socotra, these people have lived there since time immemorial, and it's easy to call them Arabs. And they may today call themselves that, but they reflect this ancient language and culture that, is it fair to say it's Arabic?
I mean, they would agree that so there's two languages. There's the the state Arabic, but there's also the local Arabian, or whatever they want to call it, that is not mutually intelligible, not even with Arabic, but even with the other South Arabian languages in Hadramaut and those other areas. So they have this unique dialect. But yeah, I think up until the 15th or later the century, they weren't thought of as Arabs, and they weren't Muslim. They were Christian up until
right.
yeah.
Yeah, St. Thomas stopped there too on his way, preaching in the further east or South Asia. That whole area from the Red Sea down, the Red Sea run was a trading route you could take theoretically that would connect the Mediterranean all the way down, along what would today be Saudi Arabia, and as you squirt out, if that's the right term, into the Indian Ocean. Here's this island, and so you're saying now it's part of the UAE.
Yeah, UAE's functioning like it's their island. They're gonna hold a referendum there to see if the people, which they do, want to be part of the UAE and everything. And they've already granted 85 families citizenship. So they're building military bases. I mean, the negative part, the side of Soqatris that don't want this, is because they don't want they're very big on their environment, the flora and the fauna and all that.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want that to kind of be like, they don't want stuff to be built over those things. They want to keep everything natural. So they're worried that UAE wants to turn that into like Dubai or something like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Another, billionaire's playground.
Yeah. There's also They've also occupied, they haven't gone to this extent, but they've also occupied Asab in Eritrea, and Berbera in Somaliland, and Mayun, the island of Mayun, another Yemeni island that doesn't have inhabitants, I think. I don't actually, I think it might. It might have a few inhabitants. They also have that island now too from Yemen. This all happened because of the Yemeni civil war,
Right, yeah.
which is also has the border issues.
I was going to say that may be another case of a border changing, because there were two Yemens
Yeah,
for
yeah.
many decades.
There were two in like the late half of the 20th century. Before that, there were multiple. There are many more. There were like 4 or 5.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah. I often I've seen people do thought experiments, I guess they're called, but it's fun, uh, like the game Risk, right? It's fun to redraw maps, and I've seen the most in the Middle East. Africa is another place probably where you could redraw maps, and a lot of the similar rules apply. Who lives where, what's the border and why? Is it an open border, because people are used to crossing? Because, who are you to draw a line somewhere, or is it a closed border and heavily patrolled? And, what does that mean for people who have families on both sides?
I mean, in a way, it's a good thing in that what's happening now or in the future, what's going to happen, and that the inhabitants of these areas are with time having a say in the borders. So like Yemen, it's done. It's going to be divided again. There's no way that it could be. That's my opinion. There's no way that it's going to be just Yemen now. The North Yemen is clearly for the Houthis. The South is for this. They call it South Arabia. It's like the country that used to exist there before. And then the east part of it is Hadramaut, and these people never thought they were the same thing as each other. So they're choosing in their own civil war to go back to how they were, because that's what they feel they should do. So they have now a say in their borders in a way. It's not like perfect, but in a way they have it. So Qataris, who have all throughout their whole history been attached to this Arabian coast, now are choosing to be instead with the Gulf in the eastern half of the peninsula. I think that's the only way that I can think of that these people can have a say in where their borders are. Like I don't know how long Iraq can last, or Syria, you know.
And that's kind of what I'm wondering too, going forward, right? Like, number one, how do we keep our nose out of it? And number two, do we have, when I say we, I'm talking about people in the Western world, North America, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, things like that. Do we have a vested interest in the borders staying the way they are, right? Like, is it beneficial for the meddling powers to maintain a status quo, or is it beneficial to re-engineer them? Like, I know Syria, they've tried to, since the 60s, get a more, moderate Sunni government running that region, because it would do more for things like mobility contracts, anything going across from the east to the Mediterranean. What's our stake in it? And our, again, like, just abstractly our, not necessarily you or me. We're a different sort of.
Yeah. You like American, the interest of the American government. I think currently our interests would be, for in Yemen at least, it would be for a Sunni government, but that doesn't mean that our interests. I think our interests could change wisely, so it doesn't have to be that way. I think it it's like that in a way, just because we're lazy and Saudi Arabia prefers that, so let's just go with that kind of thing. Same with Syria. It's the balance of power shifted drastically once Saddam was removed. It changed everything. So you had Saddam, who was a secular Sunni, ruling Iraq, um, which was a Shia majority country with this huge Kurdish population
Right.
too. It was once that was over, then you have a Shia government there, which is an Iranian puppet, and you have this kind of sweep now of the region with Iranian like favored governments of Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. Now Yemen too, because of the Houthis. So we're worried as America because of this. And I don't know if that's really the stance that we should take. I think that we could take each government at its own and be able to have relations with it on that level. But it all started, yes, because of our meddling in the first place. So
Well,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, no, I mean, you bring up an important point too. Like there's the local, call it a rivalry, and maybe it's competition. There's probably a better word for it,
Yeah.
but you've got, Iran, you've got Saudi Arabia. You could even include Turkey in the conversation. And it seems like there were these regional players who, they make deals with the big kids down the street, right? Like, whether it's Britain or the United States, etc., Russia, as some of these were Eastern Bloc countries, people forget, like Syria, they still host Russian military bases that go back to the Cold War, right?
Right.
So how much is this really not a Western issue, not a US issue per se, but, or a British issue for that matter, but one of the regional players? Like, are they really the power brokers, and we, based on what deals or what sort of relationships we have with them, go along for the ride, or are we jointly making policy, and pushing it?
So I think we began making policy. Then we took the stance of going along for the ride. And I think now we're back to thinking, getting back to like the table and or the drawing board or whatever that is that they say, and thinking about what we want our policy to be. Because in the last administration leading up through this, I think a lot of things changed in from what I see in practice. There have been changes in the way we're functioning. So, for example, we're no longer involved in the Yemeni civil war. We're no longer backing anyone. Unfortunately, this current administration with Azerbaijan went back into that. So that was unfortunate. But no, it looks like the policy is going to where maybe we don't have to be kind of this one way, everything pro Saudi, because we have options now where we didn't used to before. The UAE has become a major power in the region, one of the strongest countries, believe it or not. And that is a very good alternative for us to back, because of their worldview. It's not the same. It's they have historically in their history as the Emirates, and the different tribes that are there, who are constantly fighting the Wahhabis. That was their main enemy for most of their history, was the Wahhabis. So we don't have to we don't only have one friend now. We have many options. And I think that changed some things for us.
Yeah, well, it's a wild place. It's the wild Middle East. With their own deserts and cowboy traditions. And I think, this was a good exploration into just how much of well, I don't want to call it an organized mess, but it was a mess that was organized in a certain fashion. And it probably behooves us to think more critically about the region, the people, um, and not paint it over with a broad brush, especially when there are so many different players that one minute we're close to, you know, many of the Kurds, for example, right? Like we're close to the Kurds because of, common enemies, let's say, but Kurds fundamental, well, certain communities of Kurds were very close to the Soviet Union. Many of them, are very hard communists.
Mhm.
I have some family friends who, one of them is they're named after um, the Cuban revolutionaries, right? Like this man named his son Castro,
Wow.
they grew up in
Yeah.
Syria,
Yeah.
but they're like, that's historically an enemy, of the US, a rival, if, take a better term. Uh, and then all of a sudden, we have a bunch of conflagrations heat up over there. And then we say, we're not going to do this anymore. And they start throwing rocks at us again, So this has been a good talk. And I think there's so many different aspects to the conversation that we could go into more depth, and this would be an overview, right? But we could plunge into any of these um, little asides, and really explore them more. We'll definitely go into the Arab side and, what it meant to be an Arab nationalism, and who are Arabs. That's going to be a good talk.
Mm.
But any final thoughts, on the border issue and identity and self sovereignty, for the Middle East, and what direction should people go who otherwise know nothing, about this region?
I would say just be open to learning and reading and this is the last region that anyone wants to be lazy with because it's very important to know the nuances. I think that uh, we're living in a very unique time because we're the ones who are going to inherit and see the fruit of everything that happened 100 years ago to create the countries of today. So we're going to see what lasts and what doesn't and what it turns into because the Sykes-Picot borders or all any of these, whatever the name you want to call these borders, they're not divinely instituted. So they're not
Right.
going to last for they're not going to
Yeah.
last forever. So let's see what happens. I think we're getting close to a time where it's a make or break. So let's
Let's
see.
see what happens.
Yeah.
I love it. I'm going to end with that line. Let's
Yeah.
see what happens.